Hi, everyone. Welcome to this conversation with our friend, priest and theologian, James Alison. Hi, James.
Hello.
Thanks
Good to
for
see you.
joining us this is your home in Madrid, right?
It is. It
It
is. Yep.
is. Great. We're so glad you could be here to help us sort through our reactions to the recently released book with the provocative title, In the Closet of the Vatican, Power, Homosexuality, and Hypocrisy. The author is Frédéric Martel, and he claims to document a mind-blowing paradox that behind the official church teaching that gay men are objectively disordered and inherently disposed toward intrinsic moral evil and therefore unfit for the priesthood are closeted gay men at the upper echelons of the Vatican. So it is almost laughable, but the book is garnering big range of emotional reactions, and of course a lot of this was not news to you, James. You are a openly gay priest and theologian, and you've been working and teaching and writing about the challenges of being Catholic and gay for your almost entire career. Most notably, your book, Faith Beyond Resentment, really addresses this issue head on. And during Martel's investigation into the clerical closet in Latin and South America, he came across your name as someone who's been dealing with these issues and living, working, studying in Mexico, Brazil, and so he contacted you.
That's right. Yeah. I think he was tipped off by a French colleague with whom I, as it happened, had chatted. So that's how he got to hear of my existence.
Yes, and so he interviewed you, and you're a named source in the book.
I am. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you were then, really the right person to write this guide, if you will. It's like a guide to processing the content of this book, which is really quite shocking in a lot of ways. And so your essay is called "Welcome to My World: Notes on the Reception of a Bombshell." And
Yes.
it's not an exaggeration, really, to call this book a bombshell, I think. We published that essay here at Raven. It was first published on the Australian Broadcasting Company site. But we were happy to host it here and to have you here to talk with us today and sort of walk through, sort of this way of making sense of what we're learning about the extent of the which you might call the cover-up, the mendacity, the double lives.
Yeah. Or more simply, just how gay the senior clergy of the church is.
Exactly.
That's fine.
It is, they're just how gay they are. I'm going to pause for just a minute and let Sam know his battery is low on his phone, which is one of our things. We're okay with that. Okay. So I am going to be also, James, so we're broadcasting this on our Raven Facebook page, and I'm trying to just find it so I can see, here it is, so I can see the comments. So folks, please come join the conversation by posting your comments on Facebook, and I will be monitoring that as our conversation goes along, and we'll see if we can bring some folks into the conversation. So James, let's start by clarifying what the book is and is not about, because it was actually, I think it's sort of an unfortunate coincidence that it was released the day that the Vatican Conference on the Protection of Minors began. So
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that was much more of a coincidence and much less of a deliberate plan than some people have assumed. It was really because, as you probably know, the Vatican summit was called very late in the day and with very short notice. I think like 5 months' notice, which by Vatican terms is very short notice for a meeting. And of course, Frédéric has had his book available since July or August of last year in French. And for all the publishers in all these 8 different languages to come together with a date for their joint publication for spring meant that they had to come together with a date, and that it was the same date as the beginning of the of the summit is, I think, an unfortunate coincidence, but it's much more of a coincidence than a deliberate attempt to torpedo something.
Right, because the book is not directly about the clergy abuse scandal in the church.
No, it's not. And I think that was the first concern of a number of people who heard about it. Oh my God, here is this book which is going to give weapons into the hands of those people who say, well, all of this clergy abuse is because of the gay people. And by this stage, thank heavens, the leaders in the Vatican have done their homework and do know that there is no plausible link between these two, that all the experts tell them that there is nothing inherent in homosexuality that makes someone with that orientation to be any more or any less inclined to pedophilia than heterosexuality. In other words, it's not an indicator for pedophilia. But I think that what the book does do, which is something slightly different from that, is that it shows a world of mendacity which does come some way towards at least correlating with the world of cover-up, which we've all seen with relation to the church. As I think everybody knows, ever since Watergate, the cover-up is worse than the crime. And I think that everyone is at least as disgusted, if not more disgusted, by the way in which church authorities have handled abusers. They're more angry about that in many cases than the abuse itself, because very often the way that the church authorities handle it have actually multiplied the number of people abused by sending on priests to different places and trying to pretend that nothing happened. And the question of why this culture of cover-up, and this book does at least suggest, and it's a plausible hypothesis, that one of the reasons behind the church's cover-up, the tendency to cover up, is because there is so much fear about admitting homosexuality, which makes people very blackmailable. So that's one of the things that does come up. But it's, as it were, so if you like, there is a link, but it's not the link that most people think.
Right. Can you say a little more about that link, about the fear of being blackmailed and being outed, if you will, if you exposed clerical abuse?
Yes. That, well, I think people's just first reaction is, I think that an awful lot of people, at least until recently, didn't know that there was a difference between paedophilia and homosexuality. And they were used to a don't ask, don't tell world with relation to homosexuality ever since they were in the seminary. And the result is partly out of mercy, in other words, don't throw stones in a glass house, and also partly out of fear of blackmail. We've all got skeletons in the closet here, even if there are only, very minor issues. So it's much, much better to try and keep everything quiet. So I think that both mercy and fear of blackmail, we don't want this to be looked at. This is dirty laundry that no one wants washed. And it's only, of course, it's taken a long time for people to be able to make it between pedophilia and homosexuality. And once they've made that distinction, of course, it's fairly obvious to people in the civil world. But in a world in which people can't be honest about homosexuality, still liable to fear of themselves being pointed to if they start talking openly about this area.
Yeah. One of the things that was really there were a lot of very startling things in the book. But one thing that really struck me was the need for this denial, this double life that the priests felt they had to live. Many priests seem to be growing in comfort through their careers with their homosexuality and beginning to realize, wait, this isn't some sort of weird disorder, it's just who I am. But yet they had to keep it secret. They had to keep lying about who they were. And that seemed to be the source of most of the problems.
I think that's right. I think that as people become more honest, this is one of the weird things. Given that people actually do find the possibility to become quite healthy within their life as the church, they then find that their healthiness is limited by the fact that if they say so, against the teaching of the church. So if they say so, they're going to be pointed at and got rid of or strongly marginalized.
Yep.
So you find the very sad situation that those who know the church's teaching is wrong aren't able to say so,
mm-hmm.
because they will immediately be pointed at as being bad priests who are merely speaking in favor of their own vices.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas bad people, and some are very bad people, who know perfectly well what they are, but have built a career about attacking it, those who engage in what I believe is called reaction formation, they're the ones who get to sing the song. They're the ones who can wave the flag and be the paladins of virtue.
Yeah.
And that's a completely sick situation, and it's a sick situation which everybody knows about, which is that the honest can't be honest, and the liars can't stop lying.
Right. I want to turn to the issues of who this author is and just how much we can trust what he's telling us.
Right. Well, as you can imagine, I was a bit nervous about that when I got an email from him asking to interview me. So I rang friends in France, and they told me a bit about him. Mm-hmm. But then he himself offered to send me a copy of a book which he'd written in the 2 or 3 years ago, which was called Global Gay. And it was his study of how the brand gay had gone global. Yeah. In other words, how the same word, which is obviously derived from Anglo-Saxon culture, had come to refer to an area of downtown Tokyo, an area of downtown Taipei, an area of downtown Sydney, not an area of downtown Tehran, but at least a way of living amongst certain people in downtown Tehran. So he wanted to explore all of that in his book. So I read the book, which is an easy read. And amongst the cities he explored were a couple, or several in fact, which I know quite well, including the gay life in those cities. And what he had to say resonated really quite strongly with my own impressions of it. And I appreciated also his anthropological nuance in dealing with these different places. So I thought to myself, okay, he's there's a sensitivity here to cultural difference. And then I'm more inclined to believe him when he describes cities that I've never been to.
Yeah.
If when he describes the ones that I know, right, I'm with him on this. So, I suppose I could be entirely wrong. It could be that he's particularly good at describing cities that I've been to and particularly bad at, but it seems unlikely in general. If someone is good about things then probably they're reliable about things you don't know.
They're pretty good, and for a nice straight grandma like myself, reading about this gay culture that I have no real access to was really quite. I was happy to have your affirmation that this does happen. This is going on, even to the extent of the freedom that gay clergy feel to have loving relationships with each other, with other men, and also the extent to which they pay for sex. I mean, there was this whole wide range of sexual experiences that very closeted gay priests were having around the globe.
Yep, it's a striking ethnography.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah,
It's
it
a
is.
striking ethnography. And I think it's worth remembering that his training is in sociology. So that's how he looks at things, and I think that it is actually a good sociological take. And he sees patterns and how patterns structure things in different places and how they repeat themselves in different places. So yes, he found that basically the same setup as exists in the Vatican exists in dioceses and churches in different parts of the world. And in as far as I have access to these things, he describes what I know to be true. So I'm, my first reaction on reading the book was amazement, but not that it was untrue, but that it was so much bigger than I had thought.
Right.
What blew me away was the dimension of the thing,
Right.
not the thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is stunning. Yeah.
And that was what seemed to me to be absolutely amazing, is the cumulative effect of what is described. And how constant it is.
One of the difficulties he faced in doing this kind of research is that it's secret stuff. People don't want to talk about it. They don't want to be on the record. You're one of the few people who are on the record with your observations. But so he, one of the things that I was uncomfortable about with the book is that it can feel gossipy. And there's a lot of suggestive, open-ended questions, innuendo that he was using, insinuations, and so can you address that aspect of the book?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the first thing you have to say about that is that if you poke around in a honeycomb, you will get covered with sweet golden liquid. If you poke around in a clerical closet, you will get covered in gossip.
Yeah.
It's an extremely, extremely gossipy environment. And in that sense, this is something interesting, which he points out, and which other people older than me, I mean, I'm coming up to 60, but people in their 70s and older who remember better than I what gay life was like before liberation, before Stonewall, was that it was a series of very gossipy small places in which everyone was gossiping about everyone else. Everyone had female nicknames. Bitchy codes were used about everything. And what Martel discovers, and he's slightly younger than me, and therefore has lived most of his life in a much more open environment, is that really the pre-Stonewall world is alive and well. If you like, it's a Jurassic Park preserved in amber of what closeted gay life used to be like in the 1940s and 1950s. It's a gerontocracy, so it's run by much elder people who themselves grew up at times when these things were not able to be talked about, or able to be talked about only in very careful code, because there were civil consequences, and quite drastic civil consequences. The laws were changed starting in the 1960s onwards in many cases. But of course, that world produces a massive cognitive dissonance with younger people, 30-year-olds who are coming to work, fresh out of seminary from somewhere in South America and come to work in Rome. They're in a completely different universe as regards what they think is normal and what can be talked about. So to find them, as it were, having to play by closet rules from the 1940s and 1950s already creates an amazing cognitive dissonance. So yeah, that is part of what he discovered. So this immensely gossipy, very febrile world. But so he had to be very careful, and he's well known in the profession. And this is something which I take pleasure in, as I've discovered from hearing from other people, that he's well known in the journalistic profession as extremely scrupulous about sources and evidence. I mean, in whatever field he's dealing with. And so he was not just going to take the word of, about that gossipy queen, as it were, which is what it sometimes sounds like. I mean, if someone says, I think you will find that Cardinal X does this and that his boyfriend is Y, he would have found 4 or 5 different witnesses to it, but from quite different perspectives, made quite sure that none of them had a personal axe to grind about the person. In other words, were simply defaming them for some political purpose. And then would try to talk either to the secretary or the boyfriend in question, or to the cardinal in question, in as far as it was possible to have an open conversation about such things. So that's a very slow, meticulous process. Now, I share your sense that that sometimes you read the book. It's written in a florid, gay, gossipy style, but that's if you like, that's him having fun as a French gay writer. Personally, that's not my shtick. I don't like that. I think lots of Anglo-Saxon people find that style a little bit off-putting. Having said that, he's quite careful. If he can say publicly something about X without legal consequences, he will. And he's prepared to say it if he knows he would have legal backing if he were tried, if an attempt were made to process him for it. Because, of course, remember that it's not, at least in European law, and I imagine the same is true in the United States, to say that someone is gay is not it's not a defamatory thing. You may be right or you may be wrong, just as you may be right to say that somebody has green irises or is left-handed, or you may be wrong. But it's not to say that is not a matter of defamation. You can be corrected. But obviously, while that's true in civil society, it's not true in the church. For the church, effectively, to say something true about someone that they themselves are pretending is not true, is to expose them as being dishonest.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem that they've got themselves into with this strange double world of not allowing people honesty.
Right.
Which is that people from the outside can look in and see something that's quite clear, and people from the inside know that it's true and can't say it.
And can't say it, yeah.
So his principle is, if he can say it in such a way that it would stand up in court, he will. That's what journalists do. If he's got the evidence, could defend it in court, but knows that the witnesses aren't yet ready themselves to give witness, then he won't say it. He'll insinuate it. But so when he insinuates, it's not because he doesn't know. It's because he doesn't know to a standard of legal, legal certainty of the sort that his publishers would say, we are not prepared to say this because we think we might lose in court.
Yeah.
I mean, and he's given me, I can't mention their names, obviously, but he's mentioned to me a couple of names of people that he knows about with evidence from different people, and that they're not yet prepared to go on the record. The time may come when they're prepared to go on the record, in which case turned out to have been a very well-founded insinuation, as it were.
Right. Yeah, it was a difficult, I mean, he's following a trail of gossip into a place of secrecy where people are keeping secrets and are afraid of the consequences of revealing them.
Well, the funny thing is that they're keeping secrets and at the same time not keeping secrets. That's the funny thing. At the same time, and this is, I think, one of the amazing things which he brings out, which I'm sure you've noticed, which is at the same time, these same people for whom it's all secret are remarkably brazen about it within what they assume to be their sphere of impunity. So that's one of the things that is amazing. You read it and you think, how do these people think they can get away with it?
Right.
and it reminds me of the story, which I think I've probably told you of. It was reported by one of Cardinal Spellman's lovers, who was a ballet dancer in New York, when talking about a famous party that Spellman was at, which I think J. Edgar Hoover was at and Gore Vidal was at. Maybe it was Gore Vidal who recounted the story, the dancer who had been Spellman's lover. And I asked Cardinal Spellman, how do you get away with it? Spellman said to him, no one would believe it.
Yeah.
And I think that's it. There's an amazing dissonant belief, and I bumped into this, and I've a very high-ranking churchman who, on reading evidence from this book, a high-ranking churchman with whom he had lived, at first couldn't believe it, but then saw that the records were from the United States intelligence services to do with South America. In other words, that this was not gossip that was made up.
Right.
This was something the US intelligence were aware that someone was being blackmailed by the security services of a South American nation.
Right.
Specifically for these reasons, which shows that you can live alongside someone and have no idea.
Yeah, what's happening?
That's the way this series of closets work.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was just going to ask you to talk about how the church got in this situation, because it seems, that from Vatican II in the 60s, there was this movement of opening up, of trying to be more liberal and modern and, keep pace with what we were learning about what it means to be human and all sorts of issues around sexuality, whether it was reproductive things and whatever. And then something like the church just sort of closed down and sort of, the rest of the world seemed to be learning more and more about the normalcy, the sheer unremarkability of gayness, and the church stopped learning. What happened?
Yes, yeah. I think that's one of the questions that historians will start to ask now that they're beginning to see the evidence of what has happened. And it looks awfully like a panic attack. It looks as though people formed at the very end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, wanting to learn how to love, becoming aware of love affairs with people of their own sex, and needing this to be something that was chaste and beautiful and good, and not something that was the seamy side of the underworld that was just terrifying to them. So I think that there were, for certain churches, a strong desire to sublimate what they couldn't name as being gay, that wasn't how it was talked about at the time, into what we would now call platonic love or special love, or a variety of terms. And Martel follows quite clearly the way this was done with the work of the French author Jacques Maritain.
Yes.
I thought it was very interesting. For me, that was entirely new.
Was it?
Well, I'd seen more of how this worked in the English-speaking world, but for me, that, which affected both the French and Italian-speaking world, that was quite a new, set of melodies, set of variations around the same melody, if you like.
Right.
Think of how the great French authors of the time were dealing, the Gide and company were dealing with this in the way that some of our, war poets, our gay war poets, many of whom, alas, were killed in the First World War, were also beginning to explore this kind of, these kind of things. So, there was a lot going on in the early 20th century.
Yeah, but this whole feeling that the only way to be a good homosexual was to be a chaste homosexual. Right.
Well, of course, it was the only one. It was certainly, remember that everything else was a mortal sin.
Yeah.
And that was how it was considered at the time. So the horror at as the realization that actually this is something normal, the suggestion, therefore, that they needed to accept themselves as something. I mean, that sounded like you must accept an abomination into yourself. And you could imagine, I think, that many people would have said, no, I sacrifice myself entirely to you, God, in order for me not to be this. I will take on board whatever persona you give me, not to be this. And I think that, if you like, has been the great battle since then with what members of a certain generation were able to do, and which has become increasingly impossible for following generations to go through, as we've learned to some extent to bridge, to overcome the fear of being the abomination. We were brought up thinking all this was, and to start to allow grace to take us out of the place of shame. But the people who ran the show, I think, they realized that with the changes that were coming with Vatican II, it would include changes in this matter as well. And I think there was a massive panic around this. And therefore, it's not surprising that those who knew how to react with panic got to be the hardliners who ran the show thereafter.
Yeah.
And the result is that you had, this is what I think the book shows, the people around John Paul II, in particular, terrifying bunch when you look, start to look at the evidence of who they were, what their lives were like. Ratzinger comes out much less badly than the others. And in fact, he gets a much more sympathetic treatment than I think some people would like in Martel's book. But at least one of the things about him is it was perfectly clear that he was honest and not bribable in the way that others who were simply going along with playing a double game. They were singing from John Paul's hymn sheet. We sign up to all your positions, and now let us get on with our lives. And some of these guys were really terrifying.
Yeah.
And I think that's the world that has proved to be unsustainable. Yeah. And I think that it's from within that world that you're getting all these people speaking out, speaking to Martel.
Yes. There seemed to be this a sense of relief coming towards him, of people finally having a place to talk about it, a way to come out in the open about what they want to talk about but are trapped. Career consequences, all kinds of things if you say anything about your sexuality.
Absolutely. Well, and remember, from an older generation, not only career consequences, but presumption of hell. And I think that's one of the things that's worth remembering is that how far many young gay kids have to go from a presumption of hell to being able to start standing up and being honest. So you're dealing with that. And I think that one of, as everyone has noticed this, that fear of hell has ceased to be one of the main flavors of Western Christianity. It doesn't occupy the place in everyone's imagination that it used to occupy. And lots of people, regret this. What's happened to hell? What's happened to sin? And so on and so forth. And I think that one of the reasons is that so many people have had actually to deal with the real fear of hell concerning such matters as these. And once you've dealt with that, you're not going to be frightened of mere church leaders barking at you.
Yeah.
I mean, you know in yourself that it's not wrong. But that means that you're therefore playing a game for them. It's not that you're in real belief that they might send you to hell.
Yeah. No, I know I certainly know people who have gone through that struggle themselves and been suicidal, and we haven't all quite moved past that feeling.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, there's something wrong.
No, I've heard
Especially very religious people, people who are want to be good Christians, are
Exactly.
especially tormented.
Well, think that many of these high-ranking churchmen are just such people.
Yeah.
Some are obviously not. Some of them are cynical and completely worldly players, but others are people striving for holiness in a from a very frightened place.
Yeah. Yeah, that certainly comes out in the book. So some of them you want to strangle them that you read about, and others you feel like, oh my God, you just feel very sorry.
Yes, there's a great deal of misery there, and one hopes that by the lid coming off, little by little, this thick smoke of lies will able to dissipate a bit.
As it does come out into the open, though, the response to the book, it's easy to become scandalized by what you read in there. And of course, scandal and mimetic theory go very well together.
Yeah.
And in fact, Betsy Hansbrough is asking if when we use the word scandal about this, are we talking about scandal in the Girardian sense, about how we are reacting to this book?
To be honest, because I wasn't scandalized by it, I'm not sure. But then I've had a lot of time, as it were, to see that I'm the same as them. I'm not. It sounds a bizarre thing. It sounds a bizarre thing to say, but I was shown lots of myself in the book. Obviously not because I appear that much. I don't, but because at different times where I knew where I was at that time, and so I could imagine things. But I wonder, what is it that people are being scandalized by? You see, you have this weird sensation that actually, if you'd asked people before the existence of this book and before they'd ever heard of the existence of this book, do you think the Vatican is full of gossipy old queens? People said, yeah, of course the Vatican's full of gossipy queens. We all know that. It's one of the kinds of things that everybody knew until the moment that they're actually confronted with the evidence that it really is like that. When suddenly everybody is shocked and can't really believe it. Yeah, I think so. I think that the reality check of what this means for understanding how we live together as church, that is a potential, an area of potential scandal, that people will allow themselves either to be so appalled that they just say, oh, well, we can't believe anything these people say. Or we just, go off somewhere else, or else be so fascinated that they want every salacious detail. Neither seems to me to be very helpful. For me, at least, if the avoiding the scandal is to recognize that what we've got is one of the fruits of Jesus dwelling in a place of shame. That because he dwells in a place of shame, and because the death that is associated with that can't hold him, so the light and the mercy begin to show through from the place of shame. And what seemed to have a sacred mystique turns out not to have a sacred mystique. It turns out to be full of frightened, feeble people rather like us. Some of them more exotic and bizarre than people like us, at least immediately, but an awful lot very like us. And that this seems to me to be this is part of how forgiveness appears by grace showing through the place of shame. That's how that's how I read it. For me, the interesting question is, what does God forgiving us look like? One of the first things God forgiving us looks like is us showing us what's in need of being forgiven, rather than allowing us to keep our entirely fake elastoplaster over the over the wound. Forgiven church people are people who are able to preach a gospel of mercy. Unforgiven church people, Lord alone knows what they're preaching, but it sure ain't a gospel of mercy. Does that make sense?
I think so.
So I hope that's. I very much appreciate Betsy's question.
Right.
Yeah, but it would be interesting. It would be interesting to know. In a sense, because I've been at this so long, I'm not scandalized by it, and maybe I'm wrong not to be. Maybe I ought to be much more scandalized.
Right.
By it. I know some people who are profoundly angry. Actually, Andrew Sullivan gave a rather beautiful example of real anger in his response to it. I thought his review was a very good review of Martel, and he's a professional journalist, so he knows what real journalism looks like. But he was really angry at the duplicity of these hard-faced guys who've been talking down at the rest of us, all this time. And I think that, I guess I ought to be more angry about that, but I can't waste the energy, to be quite frank.
Well, Jesus warns against the scandalon as a stumbling block to following him.
Well, I mean, when Jesus, the key phrase, as I understand, is Jesus saying, "And blessed are those who are not scandalized by me." And the people who were going to be scandalized by him were not sinners. The people who were scandalized by him were the righteous, because what they thought righteousness should be like. So, in a sense, any of us who play teachers of righteousness are always going to be scandals, and Jesus will continuously break through and be the one who allows us to follow him without being scandalized, because he loves us as we are, and he's not into us being crazy examples of some sort of goodness that we need to pretend to in order not to give the game away or something. But that requires real the gift of faith in the incarnation, really close up.
Doesn't it though? Well, and you give some, I think, some really concrete ways that we can enter into a non-scandalized way of reacting in your essay, and because honestly, it really is hard not to stand in judgment and say, you betrayed our trust, you've lied, and so maybe we can. You jokingly say that one of the unhelpful reactions is just to say, well, why you just don't enforce celibacy, no matter what your orientation is. Just everybody recommit to celibacy and we'll be fine. And you say, let me gay-splain why that's not going to work.
Yes.
In your essay. And I find that your gay-splanation very helpful. So maybe you could go into it a little bit.
Yeah, it's a curious point, because so many people, I think, wanting and genuinely being, wanting to be gay-friendly, say, I can't see I've got no problem with gay priests. They should just have the same. But what that presumes is that everybody is starting from the same place. And if you're a young gay kid coming into seminary, you're not starting from the same place as a young straight kid coming from seminary, coming into seminary. And you're not coming into the same place as a young straight kid coming into seminary. You're coming into a place for which a precondition of your acceptance is agreement not to speak about who you are in the first person as a normal part of your life. And if you like, and this is one of the weird things, if you prohibit honesty and you prohibit some, very, very few people will be able to live a life in which they agree to be dishonest and they have no sex. But most people will break one of those two rules.
Sure.
And easily the least consequential one to break is the one about sex. Right. Because if you break the one about honesty, that has real consequences for your life. It means that you are therefore known as that person. You are assumed to be therefore in some kind of conflict with church teaching, and you are effectively in some kind of conflict with church teaching. So say goodbye to any of the promotions or jobs, or whatever it is that you wanted. Or you will be looked at askance by your colleagues because you can't be blackmailed, and they can, which means you can't be trusted.
Right. You're
not playing the game. So you've broken omerta. And that's the sad reality. The sad reality is that celibacy means two quite different things if you're straight and if you're gay. If you're gay, it's basically a hoop to be jumped over on the grounds that whether you obey it or disobey it, no one, under most circumstances, no one will know. It's invisible. It has no consequences. But the key thing is not to be honest. Whereas if you're straight, you have every opportunity to be honest, starting from the word go. In other words, honesty is simply normal. You assume that other people are like that. But on the contrary, any incontinence is likely to have very grave consequences, particularly to be economically more vulnerable, the woman, and with the potential of childbearing, at least during a certain time of her life. So the relationship between sex and honesty is entirely different between the two. And I think that this is one of the things that thoroughly decent, non-homophobic straight people simply don't see, is how honesty is easy for them. The celibacy may be extremely difficult for them. But the honesty, at least as regards who they like and why they like them, is not something that they're forbidden to talk about. No one would think it odd if in a homily Father Joe mentions when he was young and dating glorious, beautiful Isabel or whatever. Everyone will like that sort of story and think, how normal Father is. But no kind of censorship on that sort of honesty. Whereas the reverse, you can imagine, is simply is a death sentence. So until the issue of honesty is dealt with, you can insist upon celibacy and continence as much as you like, and no one will notice, and people will still play the same old "don't ask, don't tell" blackmail game.
Right. Well, I think, at the risk of embarrassing you, James, when Martel speaks about you, he says you were, how does he put it, one of the most brave people that he met in the course of doing this book. And I think it is because of your honesty about who you are and how you have insisted on being honest about who you are. And you have had to deal with the consequences of that.
Yeah, and reading this book, one of the things, wow, how much easier it has been to deal with the consequences of that than to deal with the consequences of not that.
Interesting, yeah.
Whoa. my sense of relief, A, that all this is coming out, and B, what an extraordinary gift it was that I shouldn't have been able to go through with the game. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I have no, as I say, I'm very grateful for certain elements of my evangelical Protestant background where honesty is very important.
Right.
One must attempt to bring together truthfulness, transparency, even if that makes one a thoroughly annoying person.
Or makes you very lovable.
Well, that's very kind. That's very kind of you.
Yes. Well, and and a very powerful voice. Because out of your own witness to the joy that comes from truth telling, you're able to speak authentically to us, and so that's really important.
Important for me in all this is that Christianity depends on witnesses. And what's really sad and sick about all this is that here you have all these splendid people, many of whom could be witnesses to Jesus, and yet they're trapped into being half witnesses. They can't speak in the first person. I think that this is a terrible, terrible loss. At a time when what we need is witnesses. And Pope Francis makes it quite clear, Christianity is a religion which depends on witness. But for that, you need to have people who are able to speak in the first person as sinners, but where people can see that although they're sinners, they're not trying to pull a fast one on them. And if you don't have that, if you have professionals of the closet, they're not witnesses to anything except the power of the closet to dampen their witness. So, but this, I think this is a question not of gay or not gay. This is a question of how do we manage to make and keep alive Christianity as viable in the 21st century, where the expectations of transparency and honesty and so forth are so much greater. Yeah.
Well, yes, we have a comment from Wesley Dunbar saying, "Thank you for lifting up honesty and truthfulness as the highest of values." And Betsy is pointing to the fact that the Methodist Church is going through a difficult moment on this issue right now. And, you kind of wish they could learn from the mistakes of their brethren in the Catholic Church. James, can I ask you, as we're wrapping up, coming to the end of our hour, do you see signs that things are changing under Pope Francis, or I got senses of hopefulness in the book about the way Francis is marginalizing the really strident, homophobic clerics, and so it felt positive to me in some ways. How are you seeing it?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that people have at last worked out that when someone is really strict, and particularly when they're obsessively strict on this issue, they have a problem. And I think that whereas, as recently as 10 years ago, people were not sure about that. I think that people now are pretty clear about that. And I think that it's pretty clear to everyone at the Vatican that that's how that works. So, I think that Francis's continued calling of attention of rigidity and suggesting that where there is rigidity, there is a double life. This is because it seems that if someone who has faith is not going to be rigid, because, faith means you're prepared to allow yourself to be changed by the one who's leading you on. Whereas rigidity means you're holding to an ideology so as to hold firm who you are. And these two are not really compatible. So, yes, I'm encouraged by that. And I'm also, to be frank, encouraged by the fact that all these people to Martel. I mean, let's face it, this book, some people will think, oh, this wicked journalist went into the Vatican and prized open all these closets to the church. Whereas, in fact, what happened was that he walked in, more or less indicated what he wanted to do, and found door after door flung open, and people wanting to tell him, sharing all. I mean, he's shown me some of the WhatsApps he's received, from high up in officials. And I get absolutely astounded by their sheer imprudence. I mean, utterly extraordinary.
Wow.
So no, the fact is that there are an awful lot of people who was just so relieved to be able to talk about this and to say, yes, this is how it is. And of course, the moment someone is able to put together enough pieces of the jigsaw puzzle so that you can see the overall picture, it's possible for everyone to start to say, okay, we've been caught. Now we don't need to play this game any longer.
Right.
So yes, I'm actually very hopeful about this. I think that this is this book, if people will actually get over their allergies when they read it, and get over perhaps certain annoyances about a certain kind of faggy style. It's rather fun for gay people and maybe rather infuriating for others. If people can get over that and see that there's a very great deal of first-rate journalistic investigation into a whole lot of different countries in the world, and this is a pretty good picture of much more of our church life than we have been used to thinking. Then I think that we are able more rationally to deal with the people who we have in front of us. I mean, we're not holding them in fake deference, attaching fake mystique to them. We're pretty much aware of who they are. And this I think is a motive of great helpfulness.
Right. Well, good. I do see it too. It is sort of a watershed moment, I think, that's sort of marking a sea change. At least that's my hope.
And so many similarities with the child cover-up, the mistreatment of nuns, the sexual abuse of nuns, the recent coming out the Vatican instructions for dealing with children of priests. So it's as though actually the time has come for all of this to be put out there, so that everyone knows that this is the and the bathwater. Now let's work out which is which.
Yeah, and let's deal with
But
it
let's
together.
Let's get together and slowly and carefully, and not in some completely Manichaean,
reactionary thing.
well, it's not in a scapegoating way.
Yeah.
I mean, we can either be Hercules and clean the Augean stables, but in which case we're part of a pagan divinity,
Right.
or we can be Jesus and allow mercy to break through the place of shame. And it seems to me that the choice is ours.
And go about the work of building the kingdom.
Go about the work of building the kingdom.
Absolutely. Well, James, thank you for your wisdom and your counsel, and thank you to people who joined in and listened and watched and made some wonderful comments. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
And look forward to the next time.
Indeed. Good.
Thanks, James.
Okay. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye.